Okay, so next topic we're looking at is economies of scale and trade. So this video is literally just a very brief introduction about the different types of economies of scale that we're going to be looking at and the relationship and the implications for international trade with it. So this is just introducing it, and then in subsequent videos we're going to expand on both of these types of economies of scale. So according to the models we've used so far, the Ricardian model, the HO model, in terms of things like, comparative advantage, one of the sort of implications of this is that the countries that are the most far apart should trade the most with each other. In other words, the ones that have very different endowments have the most to gain from trade with the other country. However, when you look at the data, or when you look at the trade patterns and the trade flows, what we actually notice is that a lot of the world trade is actually between similar countries, ones that have very similar endowments, similar technologies. So, for example, I've just taken UK because UK is a good example to do because it trades, and you can see here, it trades just over half of its trade. Its exports are with the EU, and half its imports are with the EU. Very similar countries. Yeah. Of the rest, what have we got? 15% of their exports and 9% of their imports are with North America. Again, the US and Canada mainly. And so these are countries with similar sorts of endowments, similar standards of living, and etc. So that's almost, 60 to 70% of total trade in the UK is actually with countries that are similar. And the rest is, obviously with countries that are different, but countries that often are colonial, had colonial ties with the UK as well. So the bit that we're interested in is these 60 to 65% of trade that occurs with similar countries. And so what we want to do is we want to be able to introduce a model that tries to explain this. 65%. So what's missing? Well, one of the things that's missing is that in all of the models so far, it hasn't been front and center. We haven't made it a massively overt assumption, but all of these models assume constant returns to scale. Constant returns to scale, remembering back to kind of first year micro, if you double inputs, double labour and capital, then output will double. It's a very simple way of thinking about the production of goods and services. But quite often there might be increasing returns to scale. In other words, economies of scale. In other words, we're on the, to put it in very simple terms, we're on the downward sloping section of our average cost or long run average cost curve. Now, specifically, what we're going to look at here, there are two types of economies of scale. First of all, we're going to look at external economies of scale. And when we talk about external economies of scale, we're saying that the cost per unit, average cost, depends on the size of the industry overall. Whereas with internal economies of scale, we're saying that the cost per unit depends on the size of the firm. And they have very different implications, and that's one of the things we're going to explore in the next few videos. So if it's external economies of scale, then the industry essentially is going to be quite close to being perfectly competitive. What we're going to have is lots and lots of firms, and often, as we're going to see, sort of clustered, if you like, in one geographical area. They don't have to be, but it's a common thing that we see. But if it's internal economies of scale, what we're actually talking about here is imperfect competition, either monopolistic competition. You can think about oligopolies as well, but essentially the industry is dominated by a few large firms. And that has implications. We will go back and almost sort of redo again sort of first year micro, looking at monopolies and monopolistic competition and how that can affect international trade. This is I won't say a recent introduction, if you like, or a recent addition to trade literature. This sort of stuff was initially done by Krugman himself, sort of back in the 1980s, but it's been taken up by another of the co-authors of the textbook that we're using, actually, Mark Mellitz, and has been a real genuine addition to trade theory, because it certainly matches a lot better, if you like, the reality of trade flows that we see. And just before I end this video, I just got a quick example of this. And so in Hangzhou in China, only population of 36,000, so in Chinese terms that's like a tiny little village just about. However, this tiny little village of 36,000 people produces 3 billion toothbrushes a year. In this little town, there are 990 toothbrush manufacturers. That is crazy, right? Produces 80% of China's production and a very large chunk of world production. And another thing that we're going to look at in this topic is that it started a long time ago, back in the 19th century. So there is a great deal of what we call path dependence sometimes about this. In other words, historically produced this, therefore you still produce it. And we're going to look at the implications of that. So this issue, or this phenomenon almost, if you like, that we see with the toothbrush industry is actually replicated in many industries around the world, and that's one of the main areas that we're going to look at in the next few videos.